let's start this. Good afternoon to everyone and good morning to Noam in Taxon. I think there is no need to introduce him. If you don't know who this guy is, then I bet you got the wrong link or you're in the wrong meeting. Thanks a lot again to Noam for having the time to meet with the students. They are very excited to have this opportunity to be able to meet you and to ask a question to you. Also to the others, welcome to this joint IALA CLT event like last year. So this is how we're going to do this. There are 9 students here and they are each of them is gonna ask one question to Noam. And since I think what is really interesting of this event is that the students can get to interact with him, I think it's time to start. So let's start. I'm gonna share a PowerPoint. And I think that will make easier for everyone to follow the questions. The questions are written in the PowerPoint, but it will be the students. I mean, the students will be the ones asking the questions. So let me share the PowerPoint. Okay, so I think this should be. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so question number 1. Sravasti Day is going to ask this question. So Sravasti, whenever you want.
Thank you, Uncle. Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for taking out time for this. So my question is, if merge is free, that is, if it is not motivated or triggered by features, then what is the role of features, if any, in the syntactic workspace?
Well, first of all, we have to make a distinction between interpretable and uninterpretable features. So take the obvious example on a noun phrase. The features of number are interpretable. On a verb phrase that agrees, they're not interpretable. With the interpretable features, it's clear what their function is. They have a semantic function. The really interesting case has to do with the uninterpretable features. Structural case, 5 features on verbal inflection. Why does language have them at all? It's actually a good question. There's been a lot of thought about that. There was a proposal a couple of years back that possibly the uninterpretable features serve to mark phases, but that doesn't seem to be true. So at the moment it's in limbo. We have no answer to the question why languages have uninterpretable features. They don't enter into the semantic interpretation, the conceptual intentional level. There's a question whether they're part of externalization or part of the internal system. But there really is no answer to the question of why language bothers to have them at all. It seems that you could get by fine just without having them. They do establish a relation between 2 things, but the relation is already given by structure. So seems redundant. And so I think it's a good open question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the question, Sravasti, and thanks for the answer, Noam. Let's go for the next one. Question number 2 is going to be asked by Katerina Thumopoulou. So Katerina, whenever you want.
Thank you. Well, there is an ongoing debate on whether head movement is a syntactic or a phonological operation. What is your current opinion on this matter?
Yes, it's a debate that's been going on for some time. There are arguments both ways. Head movement is quite different from other kinds of movement. One fundamental difference is it's not formulable. There is no system existing that allows you to formulate head movement. It violates the extension condition. You're raising, if you raise, say, say V to attach to T, what you end up with supposedly is an adjunction structure of T adjoined, of V adjoined to T. There's no way to formulate such an operation. Can't do it with phrase structure rules, can't do it with transformational rules. So it's used, but illegitimately, because there's no formulation. That's one reason to suspect that it's phonological. Another reason is it typically has no semantic role. A movement and A bar movement always have a semantic function, invariably, very clear one. Head movement, you really have to strain to marginal constructions to see if you can pick up some kind of semantic effect. So it looks very different in that respect. So these are the kinds of arguments that suggest that it's phonological. On the other hand, it seems to be successive cyclic. So if you say have a Barrère-Marantz type system with roots and categorical features, which seems pretty sensible to me, then the root adjoins to the categorical feature, say a small v, and that adjoins to t, and then that adjoins to c. So it looks like a successive cyclic movement, which doesn't work for phonology because it has to happen within the syntax. So there's been a conflict. And I think the answer is it's neither phonological nor syntactic. It's a morphological operation. By now, there's pretty good evidence that that there's a sharp split between the internal language, the pure I language, the language which essentially generates thoughts in traditional terms. It yields the conceptual intentional interface, split between that and the externalization system, which maps it all onto some sensory motor system, usually sounds, but we know it can be gesture, could even be touch. It's neutral in that respect. Now, there's good evidence that what reaches the CI interface, conceptual intentional interface, the thought system, doesn't involve any movement of heads. So the T, C, small v, or N, and root just all are in place. That gives you all the information you need for the CI system. Well, does that mean it's phonological? Not necessarily. There can simply be a morphological operation of amalgamation, which takes these elements, the root, the categorizer, the inflectional element, and simply amalgamates them. And it places it in one position or another, depending on parameters of the language. It will go into one of the positions where one of these things is. And that way you get VSO languages, SVO languages, SOV languages, and so on. What about C? There's pretty good evidence that raising to C, first of all, let's talk about inflection. By now, there's very good evidence that tense is not in the inflection node, it's in the V. It's part of V. It's one of the flavors of small v, along with modals, aspect, and so on. There's quite good evidence that T is there. So it's been a mistake to think of T as the top element in the inflectional system. Doesn't belong there. Inflectional system is pure 5 features. What about C? Well, raising to C really looks as if it belongs in a different part of the grammar. It's essentially part of the V-second system. It has restricted positions, very much like V-second, basically root or embedded structures interpreted as roots. And it has very different properties. So for example, it's not literally head movement. Take, for example, the sentence, what is likely to be, his opinion, what has been his opinion on this matter? Let's say, what has been his opinion on the matter we're talking about? Well, there you're not raising a head, you're raising has been. It can be even more. What will have been, what would have been his opinion if such and such? You're raising a phrase, but that's typical movement to see. It seems to just belong in a different module. So I think the answer to the question is not phonological, not syntactic, an amalgamation operation of 5 features, small v, and a root, which goes in one or another position, and so-called raising to C just doesn't happen. It's a part of the V-second phenomenon, which has different properties. So I think that, and that accounts for deals with the fact that there's no possible operation. There is no operation, so therefore we've settled it. My suspicion is that's the answer.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thanks for the question, Katerina, for the answer, Noam. Let's go for the next one, which will be asked by Irene Fernandez Serrano. Irene?
Hi, Professor. My question is related to the lecture you gave last year for the Linguistic Society of Japan. It's a bit long. You said that minimal search is an operation that marks a copy as undeletable so that the system does not need to see where internal merge has applied and just deletes all unmarked copies automatically. Could this operation also apply for features? What I mean is that could agree be equated to this minimal search operation as a device for marking certain features, I think interpretable features, as undeletable? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I don't think we have to say that the operation marks a copy as undeletable. It just doesn't say anything about it. So it just stays there. There is an operation that does delete copies, but I think that's part of externalization. Doesn't happen in the internal system. So if you have, say, what we call raising internal merge, which forms which boys did the girls expect to like each other? It's the boys who like each other. So what's reaching the mind is which boys the girls expect which boys to like each other. We're not conscious of that, but that's the internal operation. Nothing's deleted. Can't be. Otherwise, the anaphor wouldn't find its correct antecedent. Now, that's what reaches the mind, and it gives the semantic interpretation directly. Which boys the girls expect those boys to like each other. So that's automatic, so-called copy theory of movement, but it's just the operation that gives, it's the operation that's forced by simple merge, which doesn't affect anything. No tampering condition. In particular, it doesn't delete anything. Well, that's what goes on in your head. But what reaches the ear deletes the lower copy of which boys. That's a general economy operation that works through the whole externalization system. Says, delete what's unnecessary. You have to leave one copy. Otherwise, you don't know that the operation took place at all. In languages like English and Spanish, many others, you leave the top copy. Other languages, you leave the lowest one in C2 languages. There are some mixed cases, like some German dialects, a few other things to say about it. But basically, that's the way the system works. Now, that has interesting consequences. It raises problems for perception and parsing, what are called filler gap problems. Those of you who've worked on automatic parsing programs will know that one of the hardest problems is what are called filler gap problems. A sentence comes along with a WH phrase in the beginning, and then you have to search for the gap where it appears, which can be a very complicated problem. If the gap were filled, if you didn't delete, it would be much simpler. So if you actually heard which boys do the girls expect which boys to like each other, parsing would be simple. But when the gap is there, it becomes quite complicated. And with more complex ends, it can be very hard. In fact, it is the chief problem in automatic parsing and comparably in perception. So the question is, why does language make perception difficult? Well, the answer is that when, to put it metaphorically, when Mother Nature designed language, she didn't pay any attention to how it's going to be used. That's the way evolution works generally. When some change takes place and it gets restructured, the body, the system has no idea how it's going to be used and doesn't pay any attention to it. That's something that comes later in what's called the winnowing stage of evolution. So if you think about evolution generally, it has three stages schematically. One stage is something disrupts the system randomly, a random mutation, a gene transfers to another chromosome. A bacterium swallows another microorganism. That's what actually led to the development of complex cells, eukaryotic cells, complex organisms. That's why we're not all bacteria, because once some bacterium accidentally swallowed another microorganism. Well, after that takes place, nature has to find the simplest way of reconstructing the system that's been created. It's always the simplest way. It's the way natural law works. No attention to how it's going to be used. There's no idea. Later comes the third stage, the winnowing stage, natural selection. The organisms that reproduce more effectively, they survive. That's natural selection. In the case of language, it seems it never reached the winnowing stage. As far as we know, all human beings have the same language faculty. Seems that there was never any natural selection, maybe because there wasn't enough time, or maybe more interestingly, because the system is so delicately designed, so perfectly designed, that you either have it all or nothing. You can't modify it. That's the more interesting answer, and I think there's some reason to believe it's correct. But going back to this case, when the a system reached the reconstruction stage, nature simply found the most elegant answer, the one that reduces computational complexity. If you delete the copy, the lower copy, there's much less computation going on in the mind. And in the articulatory system, you don't have to do any of that computation. So it's computationally efficient to delete all but one copy. It happens to harm communicative efficiency. And in fact, it's the fact of the matter, an interesting one, is that there are many cases where computational efficiency conflicts with communicative efficiency. Simple cases are just structural ambiguity. So flying planes can be dangerous. It harms communication, but it's the simplest way for the rules to operate. Garden path sentences are another case. You know, the horse that raced past the barn fell, cases like that. Nature always sacrifices communicative efficiency and insists upon computational efficiency. It's a very interesting fact. It strongly suggests that there is a long tradition in linguistics. It goes back to the Greeks and classical Greece and India, right through the 19th century, which understood language to be a system for generating thought. 20th century changed that. Early 20th century behaviorism, structuralism changed that and reached a different result. It said language is an instrument of communication. Well, tradition turns out to be right. We have more and more evidence that language is, as the tradition, millennia-old tradition, assumed a device for generating thought. Communication is one of the many uses of language, in fact, a marginal use. And I think we're it's a minority opinion, I should say, but I think the evidence is pretty strong that the tradition, thousands of millennia-old tradition, is basically correct. And this case, the filler gap case, is just one example of it. There are many others. Well, what about agree? Could agree be involved for marking features as undeletable? Doesn't seem necessary. It doesn't seem to correlate with agree. It just seems to correlate with copy, which means, if you look at it closely, it means a CC configuration, C command configuration. A C command configuration is the simplest possible structure that can express a relation. If you think about any syntactic unit, to set containing X and Y, well, the simplest possible relation will be between, say, X and some element inside Y. That's C command. Now, there are two kinds of C command relations that we find in language. One is internal movement. I move. That does create a C command configuration. But not only that, you can have it without movement. So take a sentence, take control sentences. Like there's an example in the questions below. John wanted Mary to win, let's say. Suppose it's John wanted John to win. Well, the copy operation can say, since those two are structurally identical and they're in a C command configuration, they can be copies. The interpretive system doesn't know how it was formed. doesn't look to back history. That's not the way computations work. Computations work on what's in front of them, not what happened in the past. It's called the Markovian property of computation, not just for language, for any computation. So here the interpretive system observes a C command configuration, doesn't know how it was formed, deletes the lower element by an automatic computational efficiency operation. And I think that's basically all that has to be said about that matter. There's more to be said about this topic. I'll come back to it when we come back to this question later. But I think that's about the way it works, and it has quite interesting consequences when you think it through.
Okay, thank you, Irene, for your question.
The next question. So,
okay, yes, so let's go for the next question, question number 4, Clara Fariñas. So Clara, whenever you're ready, let's go.
Hello, Professor. In recent papers and talks, you have dispensed with pro and contra structures, all handled by merge. And I don't quite see what dependency we have between the two instances of Mary in Mary wants Mary to leave. It is not a standard movement change, but there are some similarities. One occurrence repetition is not pronounced. Could you please elaborate on that? Thank you.
Right. That's a very interesting question. There's actually, so let's take the sentence, Mary wants Mary to leave. It's not a standard movement chain, you're correct. In fact, it can't be movement. And there's a reason for that. Both occurrences of Mary have a theta role. They have different theta roles. And movement can't move into a theta position. There's a deep reason for that. It's a reason that has to do with computation quite generally. A computation has to meet a condition that's called stability. You can't change the interpretation of something in the course of a derivation. So if you're trying to prove a theorem, let's say, and you have 0 in one line, and 0 refers to 0, you can't have another line of the proof in which 0 means the smallest thing possible. Actually, that's a major question in the history of mathematics. There's a long debate about whether Isaac Newton's proofs were valid. His system of calculus is pretty complex. We don't use it. It's too intricate and complex. When you study calculus in school, you study Leibniz's system, which is simpler. But if you look at Newton's proofs, there is several centuries now, there's been debate among mathematicians as whether the proofs are valid. Did they violate stability? Well, if they did, the proofs are invalid. Turns out by now, probably they were valid, but the problem exists. Now, if internal move were to move into a theta position, it would violate this. It would mean that the item that has been moved has changed its interpretation, not a valid computation. Therefore, IM cannot move into a theta position. It's a little complex to prove, but you can show that external merge can only move into theta positions. So we have a property called duality of semantics. Internal merge moves to non-theta positions. External merge moves to theta positions. Now let's come back to Mary. Which is it? Mary wants Mary to leave. Well, 2 theta positions, 2 cases of external merge. But when the copy rule looks at it, all it sees is a C command configuration. As I said, it doesn't know how it came from. So it deletes the lower copy But then there's something quite interesting happens. We have a distinction in interpretation between whether it was internal merge or external merge. That's the old pro-trace distinction. So take a classic example, take the sentence in English, one interpreter each seemed to be assigned to the diplomats. That's okay. One interpreter each tried to be assigned to the diplomats. That's no good. Traditionally, that's called trace versus pro. Well, we don't have trace and pro any longer, but we do have a distinction between internal merge and external merge. And the internal merge cases are the ones where you have reconstruction. The good case, the seam case. Seam doesn't assign a theta role, subject theta role. So therefore, one interpreter each seemed to be assigned is internal merge. Therefore, the lower copy will be interpreted automatically. You get the right interpretation. One interpreter each tried to be assigned. That's external merge because there's a theta rule, so no reconstruction. So you automatically get the pro-trace distinction. Incidentally, in Spanish, there are lots of examples of this. Clitic movement yields all kinds of examples. If my accent weren't so terrible, I'd read some for you, but you can figure it out. French, Italian, Spanish, there's lots of pro-trace distinctions with clitics. And that's given automatically just by the duality of semantics. So we not only get the answers for the question that was asked, but we get something much deeper. We get an explanation for why you have these curious properties of control and raising with reconstruction in one case, no reconstruction in the other. Actually, that raises another question you might think about. Why does language have a control module at all? This works for subject and object control. It's a little more complicated to show it for object control, but it's basically the same. So why does language even have this system? Well, by now we have an answer to that. Language is perfect. It satisfies the strong minimalist thesis. Nature designed it in the most perfect possible way. The internal language, that is, not the external language. And if it's designed in the most perfect way, it will simply have a control module because it follows automatically from the simplest kind of merge. That raises a very interesting question. When you think about the strong minimalist thesis, it's usually understood to have a kind of disciplinary function. It says, here's the only kinds of rules you can use. You can't use other kinds. But it also has what you might call an enabling function. It says, here's the kind of modules that ought to exist, the ones that conform to the sensory, to the strong minimalist thesis. So a very interesting research question, which is right on the horizon, is whether, in fact, languages fully use all the options that are made available by the strong minimalist thesis. Could we show that the various subsystems of I language are exactly those that are made possible by the assumption that language is essentially perfect? Well, control module is one case. There's some other cases, but the question is really just on the horizon. We can begin to study it. We don't know the answer. But those are the kinds of questions that arise as soon as you ask the question about Mary wants Mary to leave. Very interesting questions. Actually, there's material in print about this if you're interested. It's in the Japanese, the Journal of the Japanese Linguistic Society just appeared a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Clara, for the question. Okay, let's move on. The next question number 5, is going to be asked by Elena Gomez. Elena?
Yes, hi. Labeling theory is comparable with syntactic subjects being endo and exocentric. Nonetheless, there is evidence showing that exocentric objects raise problems. My question then is why endocentricity is favored over exocentricity. I guess nothing emerged for that. So is it a semantic, a phonological, or an economy-based property of syntactic objects? Thanks.
Well, that's what it looks like superficially, and it's been looked at that way all along. So X-bar theory permitted only endocentric constructions. It took a long time for it to be realized, but that was a fallacy because there are plenty of exocentric constructions in language. And if you look at, I mean, X-bar theory was suggested around 1970. It wasn't until 2013, 35 years later, that it was noticed that it's just wrong. It forces expressions that are exocentric into an endocentric mold. So you have descriptions of subject predicate as being TPs because T was taken to be the head of NPVP, but there was no reason for that. It was just decided because it sounded intuitively right, but that's not a reason. So that's what led to labeling theory, the modern labeling theory. Well, so if you really look at it closely, internal merge is indeed favored for theta theory, for external merge, for exocentric, let me start with the constructions. Endocentric constructions are favored for theta theory, but there's a good reason for that. Theta theory is basically based on a head that assigns a theta role. So the complement is in a head complement position, and the head assigns the theta role. So that's endocentric. And notice that it has to be external merge. There's no way for internal merge to yield a head complement structure. So that has to be external merge, and it has to be endocentric. Well, let's take the other, and that's true of all the internal theta roles, you know, goal, agent, purpose, all that. What about the external argument? So the specifier position in an X-bar theory. Well, there you get a theta role, the agent or generally subject position. It's, but notice what the structure is. The structure is specifier V star P, and the V star P is V star and a complement. Well, the theta role for the subject is given by the V star P. That means basically the V star root amalgam, and that's a head. So the whole thing is getting its theta role back to a head. So it's not really an endocentric construction, but it kind of vaguely looks like that. So theta theory, which always traces back to a head, looks endocentric, but all the others are exocentric. Subject predicate is an exocentric construction. Every case of a bar movement, every case is exocentric. When you form a WH phrase, say, which book did John read? The which book and the John read are in an exocentric construction. in the past, it's been called CP, but that's just because it makes more sense than to call it WHP, but it was arbitrary, just as in the subject predicate case. So the fact of the matter is that we have both exocentric, endocentric constructions. Basically, the distinction basically comes back to theta theory. They all exist, and they involve different kinds of operations. For theta theory, it's always going to be external merge. For non-theta theory positions, non-theta positions, it'll be internal merge. But the preference was just based on fallacious efforts to try to fit everything into the X-bar theory framework. And it was just a mistake. Took a long time to be recognized, 35 years, in fact, but it was a mistake. It's a good lesson there.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Elena, for your question. And thanks, Noam, for the answer. Okay, let's move to question 6. Now we move into a terrain of non-strictly speaking theoretical linguistics questions, but I think that will enrich the discussion. So question 6 is going to be asked by Marta Fraile. Marta, whenever you want.
Yes, so I know that you've been asked this question many times. However, I wanted to insist. So following the concept of creativity that you develop as an innate human ability within the limits and because of the limits set by our innate cognitive capacities, do you believe that there is something of the nature of free will in the nosological process? Thank you.
Well, let's think of a concrete example. Suppose we look at language and we find the properties of control, the ones we've just been discussing. We find the properties of clitic movement with reconstruction, or the one interpreter each cases. We have data, and data tells you nothing. You just can look at the data and say puzzling. But how do we go ahead trying to find an explanation for the data? Well, it can't be induction. Induction doesn't do anything. It just says more of the same. In structural linguistics, it was just hand waving. The line was, it's analogy. What's analogy? Nobody had anything to say about it. So there is, and in fact, this is true in the sciences generally. Take Galileo. In his day, it was taken for granted that if you have two lead balls, one of them heavier than the other, the heavier one will fall faster, obviously, except it's false. Galileo invented some thought experiments. He never dropped balls off the top of the Tower of Pisa. If he had, it wouldn't have worked. But he did some very ingenious thought experiments, which do demonstrate that it has to be at the same rate, contrary to what we all believe. Well, how did he get to those thought experiments? Not by induction, not by analogy, by creativity. In the philosophy of science, it's called abduction, AB. The term goes back to Charles Sanders Peirce, great logician, philosopher in the 19th century. He argued that all of science is based, in fact, all creativity, including an infant discovering what's going on in the world, is based on what he called abduction. The mind is designed so that it, presented with data, it converges on certain possible hypotheses. There are an infinite number of hypotheses consistent with all data. You're lost. But the mind is designed so that it goes to certain hypotheses. That's a traditional rationalist conception. Descartes, Cartesian philosophers, and so on. The mind is simply designed so that it yields certain consequences. We see this all over. Descartes' example, which was again a thought experiment, but now it can be verified. He said, suppose you imagine an infant who's never seen geometrical figures, and you draw a triangle. What will the infant see? He said, the infant will see a distorted triangle, because what you drew is never a pure triangle. The lines are going to be a little wiggly, they won't quite connect at the vertex and so on. But the infant doesn't see what's actually there. What it sees is what the mind creates, perfect triangle. It's the way language works too. The infant hears noise. A chimpanzee, same auditory system, hears noise. But the infant has a mind designed to pick up eye language. So therefore, it doesn't listen to what it actually hears. It constructs in its mind something like the pure triangle. And that's how all epistemology works, whether it's an infant or a scientist or a linguist trying to find out control theory. The mind is designed so that it leads to a certain set of hypotheses. Then you can try to choose among them. If none of them work, you go on and you look for some other set of hypotheses. Well, that's a highly creative act. Nobody has a clue about how it works. Nothing. We know that all of learning, all discovery, all artistic work, everything is like that. And take the arts, Michelangelo constructing the sculpturing, the famous David. Well, the traditional views at the time, at the Renaissance, is Michelangelo could see in the marble the structure of the sculpture. You and I couldn't do it. I suppose you can't, but Michelangelo could, like other special human beings can. He saw the figure in the marble and then he just carved it out. That's art, music, everything else. So yes, there's a deep creative process involved in everything. We have no understanding of it at all. It's total mystery. Is it connected with free will? Well, we have two mysteries about which we know nothing. One of them's free will, the other's creativity. It's very hard to answer the question whether there's a relation between two processes about which we understand nothing. So there we are. Maybe there's an internal connection, maybe not. It's incidentally, if you ask a random scientist or philosopher, they'll tell you there's no free will. It's almost universally accepted, but just on the basis of prejudice. There's no evidence for it. And we all believe that there's free will. Like I believe that I can decide whether or not to raise my finger. So do you. So does everybody. Maybe we're all wrong, but there's no evidence that we're wrong. Science basically tells us nothing. Science tells us we can't deal with it. We have no way of dealing with this phenomenon. We can't disprove it. We can't explain how it works. We're just mute. Okay, maybe that's part of the intrinsic limit of human intelligence. We're not angels after all, except Angel, but the rest of us aren't. It's we're just organic creatures. Like other organic creatures, we probably have limits, but that's where we stand. Creativity is based on abduction, but we don't know what abduction is. And the same is true of creativity in the arts, creativity in science, infant acquisition of knowledge of the world, and so on. And we're just at a point where we're facing mysteries that we don't know how to penetrate. Maybe they're permanent. It's just part of our nature not to be able to answer these questions. Some people think that's a pity. I happen to think it's a good thing. It's nice to have a world out there which we can't understand, but that's personal choice.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Marta. Thanks, Noam, for the answer. Let's move, and in my case, let's fly to the next question. So Nadia is going to ask question number 7, whenever you want.
Okay, so my question is about the generative approach regards languages as natural objects internal to the mind and not social external entities. In high schools, the former approach is largely neglected. To some extent, the same happens in your society. In general, not just education. What do you think is needed for a change? Thank you.
Well, first question we should ask is whether there ought to be a change. This is a question about educational policy. How should the study of language be taught in schools? You're correct. The usual way of doing it is to say it's a social phenomenon. Linguists have generally believed that as well. So Saussurean, if you go back to de Saussure, European structuralism, was based on the idea that language is a social convention. It's just a convention that people agree to. If you go to American structuralism, it was a little narrower, but it still took the view that, say, Leonard Bloomfield, language is a convention among people in what's called a speech community, where we speak more or less the same way. So it's a social object. Generative linguistics has taken a different point of view, the point of view that language is a biological property. It's a property of me, my brain, that I speak a variety of English and not Spanish and not Swahili. Something coded my brain somewhere. So it's a biological property like my visual system. Well, I think that's the only coherent view of language. There's no coherent sociological view. What's the social convention? What's a speech community? There's no such things. They're fluid boundaries. You can set them anywhere you want. You can set it at your particular dialect of Spanish. You could call it Spanish. You could call it Romance. You could call it language, whatever you want. There's no answer. So the question really is, in the schools, should we teach the study of language as part of the sciences? That's really the question. Should it be taught as part of the sciences? Personally, I think so. People can learn a lot about their language, children can, when they study it as a science, and they're interested in it. There has been many efforts to teach linguistics, our kind of linguistics, in elementary school and high school. Kids are very excited about it. In fact, it's been used as a way to teach science, and it's a good way to teach science. The way you teach science, say chemistry, is by doing experiments, a Bunsen burner, and so on. You get data, then you try to get theories. But language has an exceptional property. The child already knows all the data. All the data's there, it's inside. So you got all the data available to you in a perfect form. Nothing wrong with it. It's the perfect data. You can start to think, how can I explain this? Why is it this way, not some other way? It's a perfect way to teach science, It works very well. Children get very excited about it. They get answers to questions. They can work them out themselves. They can carry out the abductive process. They learn how to do science. I think there's a lot of opportunities there, both to allow children to understand themselves, their own nature, their own core basic properties, what their language is, and also just as an entry into science altogether. But that's a decision to be made about educational policy. It doesn't mean that you should stop teaching the vague but useful idea of language as a kind of a sociological entity. That's useful. It's useful to be able to talk about things like Spanish, even though as linguists we know there's no such thing. But it's a kind of a useful way to get along. I don't speak Spanish, I speak English. It's useful to say that, although in detail it comes out quite differently. So I think both can be taught in parallel, but as different kinds of studies. But these are really questions about educational policy. What do we want our children to learn?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the question, Nadia, and thanks for the answer, Noam. Let's go for the question number 8, which is going to be asked by Paula Peris. So Paula, whenever you want.
Hi, my question is, are there any grounds to connect morality and the language faculty, assuming both are species-specific properties? Thank you.
Well, I think there are very good grounds to do this. And in fact, it's being done in interesting work, recent work. There's the language faculty is, as far as we know, a species-specific property. It's common to all humans, no variation that we know of, and there's no analogs in the animal world. So it's species-specific. What about morality? Seems the same. Like under my desk right now, I have 2 lovable little animals, which fortunately aren't barking and are keeping quiet. I suppose one of them eats a bird, which it's done. Can I blame it for that? I can't blame it. That's just what it does. It has no moral responsibilities. The concept just doesn't apply. It's a concept that applies to humans. Well, maybe we're making a mistake in that judgment, but I don't think so. If a lion chases a gazelle and eats it, we don't put the lion in jail, you know? It's the question just doesn't arise. So it seems to be a human property. Well, what about the nature of morality? There is a postmodern view, Foucault, others, that there is no universal, there is no morality. It's just arbitrary. Every culture does what it does. It's just a power system. In my view, that's insane. I don't even think it's worth talking about. We know perfectly well that some things are moral, others aren't. There is variation within limits, but not without any limits. And furthermore, it's interesting, over the years, there's progress in morality. So if you look back at what was considered normal and proper even 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, 200 years ago, a lot of it is just unthinkable today. Well, I think what that means is our intrinsic moral nature we're just becoming clearer about. And I think it pretty much moves in one direction. Well, in very recent years, there's been the beginnings of experimental study of this question. Study of judgments of infants, of comparative judgments in different cultures. Turns out there's a high degree of commonality. Is it connected with the language faculty? There's good reason to think that it is. If you're interested in pursuing it, there's quite interesting work, originally by John Mikhail. He's got his PhD. I was actually one of the supervisors of his PhD thesis, but he's now teaching law professor at Georgetown University. He wrote a very important book. You can look it up on the internet, on the basis of moral judgment in systems that are modeled on generative grammar. And this has been extended in more easily accessible work by Mark Hauser, very good cognitive neuroscientist and animal behavior scientist, who's done a series of books which are quite readable and runs through a lot of experimental evidence showing that there are, first of all, strong similarities, even identities, in the moral judgments of very different cultural groups, and also infants from different cultural groups have had very little exposure to the accepted moral system of their society. A lot of uniformity, and a lot of it can be accounted for on principles that have interesting similarities to the principles of language, including something like merge, some recursive process of recursive enumeration. So it's an opening. It's a very interesting area, really just being open to serious inquiry. It runs very counter to prevailing ideas that mostly come out of the postmodern, mostly French work of the last generation or so, very counter to that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Paula, for the question, and Noam for the answer. Let's move on to the final question. And before getting there, let me just thank you again. Let's thank Noam for having the time to meet with the students, and also thanks the students for having the interest in participating in this event and to be able to ask a question to Noam. So let's go for the final question. Question 9 is going to be asked by Naima Maya. So Naima, whenever you want, you can ask.
Hi, my question is, what are the most pressing challenges concerning the study of language for students like us?
Well, actually, that's the kind of question you have to answer for yourself. What am I interested in? What challenges me? What excites my imagination? That's the most pressing challenge for you. And each of us has to answer that by ourselves. Now, there is a range of options. First of all, we have to distinguish description from explanation. 99% of the work in linguistics is description. Let's find out what things are like. What's it like in Tagalog or Swahili or my dialect of Spanish or whatever it is? That's descriptive work. It tries to answer the question, what are things like? Well, if you're more imaginative, you can go on and say, why is it like this? Why not some other way? Now you're in the domain of explanation. That's very different from description. It's a much higher goal, very rarely reached. And if you look at the history of linguistics, almost never reached. In fact, I think we're only just now getting to the point where we can begin to give real explanations, genuine explanations, which is an interesting concept in itself. A genuine explanation in linguistics has to answer the question why and why not, but it also has to meet other conditions. A genuine explanation in linguistics has to account not for just the phenomena that you're studying, but how any language can be acquired, including the one you're studying. It's the condition that's been called explanatory adequacy in the modern linguistics. how can an infant acquire a language based on almost no data? And we know now that the data is very meager, and what's known by a 2 or 3-year-old child is way beyond any data that's presented. So how does that happen? That's one condition that a genuine explanation has to meet. Also has to meet another condition. How could language have evolved under the conditions of human evolution? Well, we don't know a great deal about human evolution, but some things are known. The one thing that's known is that human beings, modern humans, appeared in the evolutionary record about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. That's like yesterday in evolutionary time, very recent. Prior to the appearance of humans, there's no evidence in the archaeological record for any symbolic activity. The most you get is a couple of marks on bones and so on. But after the appearance of humans, not long after, you get very rich symbolic activity. The most exciting examples, which you can visit, I think, are in Spain. The Blombos cave, about 80,000 years ago, fantastically rich. Unfortunately, you can't get into the cave drawings anymore, like Lascaux. I was lucky I was able to get in before they closed it. It's absolutely phenomenal, can hardly believe it. Picasso, when he got in there, said, we haven't learned anything in 50,000 years. You know, it's pretty amazing when you see it. Well, all of that happens not long after humans appear. There's genomic evidence now, pretty solid, that the very small group of humans began to separate around 150,000 years ago. They all share the same language faculty, so it was already in place. Now, these numbers are, in evolutionary time, are a flick of an eye, almost instantaneous. So you put it all together, it looks as though language emerged very suddenly, along with modern humans, hasn't changed since. So what it looks like. Well, you look at that, it seems that language ought to be very simple because it emerged so suddenly. And it also ought to be perfect because that's the way nature works. On the other hand, if you look at the learnability problem, it looks as if language ought to be very complex because how can it carry an infant from almost no data to rich knowledge unless it's already all built in somehow? So you have a conundrum. On the one hand, seems language ought to be very simple. On the other hand, should be very complex. And then there's this problem of the apparent diversity of languages. That's what defines the field, I think, if you want to go beyond description. Now, we're beginning to have answers to it. It's a very exciting period, I think. In fact, kind of a new era in linguistics in which you can begin to confront these questions, sometimes answer them, as in the case of the control module, for example. Well, so what are the challenges? Depends what you're interested in. Probably almost all linguists want to do descriptive work. In fact, there are approaches to linguistics which say you have to do descriptive work, what are called usage-based approaches, or what are sometimes called corpus-based approaches. Notice that corpus-based approaches are the absolutely worst kind imaginable. People who do corpus linguistics delude themselves into thinking that they're not relying on intuitions. They're relying on intuitions, just intuitions of informants who we have no access to. Any field worker, somebody working in the Amazon, knows perfectly well that the worst kind of informant is one you have no access to. If you have access to an informant, you carry out standard field methods. An informant says something, ask them to repeat it, change it a little bit, see if it's still okay, modify it a little, see if it's subject to some operation, come back to it later in another context. That's the way you work with an informant to see whether they're giving you a real intuition or some distorted thing. When we use our own introspection, we do the same thing. We try different ways to see if we're giving genuine intuitions. Well, the worst possible situation is you don't have access to the informant. Then you can't use any field methods. That's called corpus linguistics. You can't imagine anything worse. It's totally reliant on intuitions, but intuitions of informants we have no access to. Well, if you're stuck, you don't have any informants for a language, you only have a corpus. That's what you use. But to regard that as a form of linguistics to pursue seems to me very odd. Statistical approaches are the same. They're purely descriptive. Don't answer any why questions. They work just as well for impossible languages as for possible ones. Incidentally, that's true of all the fashionable things that you read about in the newspapers. So read headlines about this exciting machine, GPT-3, which can produce texts that look more or less like the texts that people produce. Big headline in the newspaper. It's total junk, nothing. All it says is if you have a battery of supercomputers and use up half the energy in California, you can find patterns in things and you can duplicate the patterns. Absolutely worthless, has no purpose whatsoever, tells you nothing about language. It would work exactly the same with impossible languages. So it's just a way to sell computers, I guess, something like that. So all of this stuff a lot of this stuff isn't even description, but most linguistic work is description, which is fine. We want to describe things. If you can go further and explain them, even better. I should say that linguistics today is a little bit like biology when I was your age, grad student, back in the early 50s. If you take a look at biology then, it was almost all description. Person studied a particular organism, tried to find out about it. It was assumed at the time that organisms could vary in almost any possible way, and each one has to be studied on its own. Same thing was believed about languages. They can vary in any possible way. You can study each one on its own. That means just pure description. Right at that point, molecular biology began to develop with Crick and Watson finding the structure of DNA and so on. And a very small group of biologists began to get interested in explanation in biology. They were considered pretty weird. We want to study my organism, a frog, a bacterium, whatever it is. And it took a long time before you got a transition in biology where it was understood if you study biology today, you're going to start studying DNA, RNA, basic molecular biology. You'll take for granted that all organisms are basically the same. In fact, we now know that since the Cambrian explosion 500 billion years ago, basic body forms have basically not changed. A fish and a bird have basically the same body form, superficial differences. I think we're at the stage in linguistics, kind of like biology 70 years ago, when these things were just beginning. But which direction it goes depends on the choices that people like you will make. It's up to you to answer the question.
Okay, so thank you. So thanks a lot. Again, thanks for Noam. Thanks a lot for being here with us, and I'm very happy that this year we had time to ask all the questions. I'm very happy for the students. who are the ones that are that have especially enjoyed this. And let's try to repeat this next year if we have time, and if you have time for us, we will be very happy to be able to talk to you a little bit. Okay, so thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay, bye. Take care. We'll be in touch.
And I look forward to seeing your work in the future.
Yes, let's be in touch. Let's talk about that too. Okay. Bye. Okay, bye to everyone. Thanks for being here.